Hi, my name is Lauren Bennett. I am 34 years old. My older brother leaned back in the living room chair like he owned the place and said the words that ended everything we had left as a family. We've been going over the numbers, Lauren. Pregnancy is your personal decision. So the prenatal visits, the hospital delivery, and the recovery costs get split 50-50 from now on. That's the only way this stays fair. He slid a printed agreement across the coffee table without looking at me. Father agrees completely. He said it's time we stop treating your choices like they automatically become everyone else's problem. My older brother tapped the paper with one finger. You have your own salary and savings. Start acting like it. Sign tonight so we can move on with the weekend. I kept my hands still in my lap. The baby gave a small flutter under my sweater, but I didn't move. My older brother kept talking like he was reading a quarterly report. If you don't sign, we'll have to revisit how the family property and any future distributions are handled. We all contribute, or we all step back. He finally looked at me. The papers stay on the table. Sign them before Sunday night, or the conversation changes. Hi, my name is Lauren Bennett. I am 34 years old. I had driven in from Columbus 2 days earlier for what was supposed to be a quiet celebration weekend at my parents' house in the suburbs outside Dayton. My father had mentioned wanting the whole family together before the baby arrived. I was 34, 5 months along and still working full-time as a senior marketing manager at a consumer goods company. I had my own townhouse, my own savings, and a plan that did not involve asking anyone for money. The first night had been normal enough. My father grilled steaks. My older brother talked about his latest real estate deal. I listened and answered when spoken to. No one mentioned the pregnancy beyond a polite, "How are you feeling?" I went to bed early. The next afternoon, the tone shifted. My older brother asked me to step into the living room after lunch. My father was already sitting there with a folder. That was when the 5 lines landed. I read the agreement twice. It was detailed. Every copay, every supplement, every lost work hour during maternity leave was to be split. There was even a clause stating that any future family support would be reviewed based on mutual financial responsibility. My father sat silent the entire time, nodding once when my older brother finished speaking. I picked up the pen my older brother had left beside the paper. My hand was steady. I signed my name on the bottom line, dated it, and slid it back. "Done," I said. My older brother looked surprised for half a second, then recovered. "Good. That's settled. Mother wants everyone at the table by 6. He stood and left the room. My father followed without a word. I stayed on the couch for a long time after they left. The house was quiet except for the clock in the hallway. I touched my belly once, then stood up, went upstairs, and packed my bag. I did not slam doors or raise my voice. I simply folded the few things I had brought and zipped the suitcase. Downstairs, I found my father in the kitchen. I told him I was leaving that evening. He asked why. I said the agreement made it clear I was no longer welcome on the old terms. He did not argue. He just said, "Do what you think you need to do." I drove back toward Columbus that night. The highway was mostly empty. About an hour into the drive, my phone rang through the car speaker. It was my older brother calling my father. I had not meant to answer, but the screen lit up and the call connected before I could stop it. My older brother's voice filled the car. "She signed it without a fight. I told you she would. Now we can move the property transfer forward without her name on anything. The trust language we added last month will hold. She won't have any claim once the baby is born." My father's voice came through quieter. "Just make sure the paperwork stays clean. I don't want any surprises later." The call ended. I kept driving. My hands stayed on the wheel at 10 and 2. I did not cry. I did not pull over. I simply noted the time and kept going. 2 days later, I met with a lawyer in Columbus. I brought the signed agreement copies of old family trust documents I had kept over the years and a recording of the voice message that had played in my car. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I wanted to pursue anything immediately. I told her no. I wanted a clean separation first, full custody of the child when it arrived, no ongoing financial ties to the family trust. She said it was possible but would take time and would likely end any remaining relationship with my father and my older brother. I told her that was already over. I drove back to my townhouse in Columbus after the meeting with the lawyer and put the folder on the kitchen counter. The signed agreement sat on top. I made a note of the date and the time the voice message had played in the car. Then I called my doctor to confirm the next prenatal appointment and rescheduled it for a day when I would not have to explain anything to anyone else. The baby moved once while I was on the phone. I placed my hand there until the movement stopped and went back to the calendar. My father called the next morning. He said the family still planned the short drive to visit my aunt in Indiana that weekend as part of the original celebration. He thought it would be a good time to talk things through in person without lawyers. I told him I was not going. He paused and then said my older brother believed we could settle the details on the road if I just showed up. I repeated that the agreement was already signed and there was nothing left to settle. My father said he would tell my older brother what I had said. An hour later, my older brother called from my father's phone. His voice came through flat. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, Lauren. Father wants the family together for this drive. We can go over the trust language while we are in the car and keep everything private." Signing the agreement was the first step. Coming on the trip shows you are still willing to work with us. I told him I had already made other plans. He gave a short laugh that did not sound amused. Other plans. Right. You signed the paper without blinking, and now you are hiding behind a lawyer. Father and I are trying to keep the family assets intact for everyone, including the baby. If you skip the drive, do not be surprised when the distributions change. We are not going to keep adjusting for someone who refuses to participate. I said the agreement stood on its own and hung up. That was the end of the road trip discussion. I did not hear from either of them again that week. 3 days later, a number I did not recognize appeared on my phone. It was Mrs. Klein, the neighbor who had lived next to my parents' house in Ohio for 20 years. She said she had found my number in an old address book my mother had given her once. She had been thinking about the weekend I left and wanted to tell me something she had heard. I asked her to go ahead. She said she had been in her backyard the evening before I drove away and had heard my older brother and my father talking near the fence. My older brother had said the agreement would make it easier to move the rental property into his name alone because my signature on the financial split showed I was stepping back from family matters. My father had agreed and added that once the baby was born, they could finalize the trust changes without pushback. Mrs. Klein had written the conversation down because it did not sound right to her. She asked if I wanted the notes. I told her yes and asked if she would be willing to sign a statement for my lawyer. She said she would. We arranged for her to email the notes and meet with the lawyer the following week. After the call ended, I sat at the table for a long time. The voice message from the car, and now Mrs. Klein's account, lined up on the same point the agreement had never been about fairness. It had been about clearing a path for my older brother to take control of the property my parents had always said would stay in the family for all of us. For all. I called the lawyer the same afternoon and told her about Mrs. Klein. She said the additional statement would strengthen any claim of undue influence or coercion during a vulnerable period. I asked what that would mean in practice. She said it could support a request to set aside the agreement or to limit my older brother's access to the trust assets that might otherwise affect the child. I told her I did not want a long court fight. I wanted the agreement set aside quietly and a clean break, so that my older brother and my father had no further claim on decisions about the baby. She said that was possible if everyone agreed to terms. I said I would think about the next step and hung up. 2 days after that, my cousin Brooke called. She lived in Cleveland and had heard from my aunt that something had happened during the celebration weekend. Brooke asked if I was all right and whether the baby was healthy. I told her the baby was fine and that I had signed an agreement my older brother and my father had wanted. She was quiet for a moment and then said she had never liked how they handled money in the family. She offered to be a character reference if I needed one for anything official. I thanked her and told her I would let her know. After the call, I wrote her name and number in the same folder as Mrs. Klein's notes. One person outside the immediate house had chosen to speak up. That was enough for the moment. The following week, Mrs. Klein met with the lawyer and signed the statement. The lawyer called me afterward and said the document was clear and dated. She asked again what outcome I wanted. I told her I wanted the signed agreement declared invalid on the grounds that it had been presented under pressure while I was pregnant, and that the surrounding conversations showed an intent to limit my involvement in family matters. I also wanted language that prevented my older brother or my father from using the trust or the property to influence decisions about the child. The lawyer said she could draft a settlement proposal along those lines. I told her to send it. While I waited for the draft, I kept working. I finished a client presentation early and took the rest of the afternoon to organize the baby's room in the townhouse. I bought the crib and the changing table myself and had them delivered. When the delivery people asked if I needed help carrying anything upstairs, I said no. I carried the boxes one at a time. The physical work kept my mind on the next task instead of the calls that had not come. My father called once more the day after the lawyer sent the proposal. He said my older brother had seen the draft and thought it was aggressive. He asked if I would reconsider and come to the house for one more conversation without the lawyers. I told him the proposal was the conversation now. He said my older brother felt I was punishing the family for trying to be responsible with money. I said the responsibility had already been decided when the agreement was signed and the voice message was recorded. My father did not answer. He ended the call. The next morning, the lawyer called with an update. My older brother had responded through his own attorney. He was willing to set aside the pregnancy cost agreement, but wanted to keep the trust language that limited my future access to distributions. He also wanted confirmation that I would not challenge any property transfers that had already been discussed internally. The lawyer asked how I wanted to reply. I told her to reject the trust limitation and to add that any property transfers made without my knowledge while the coercion was occurring would be subject to review. She said that would likely end any remaining cooperation. I told her that was acceptable. That evening, I sat on the floor of the nursery and folded the small clothes I had bought. The baby kicked harder than before. I stayed there until the movement slowed. Then I stood up, turned off the light, and went downstairs to make tea. The folder with the voice message, transcript, Mrs. Klein's statement, and the lawyer's notes sat on the counter where I had left it. I did not open it again that night. I knew what was inside and what it meant for the people who had once been my family. The settlement proposal went back and forth for another week. My older brother's side kept trying to protect the trust changes. Each time the lawyer sent me their counter, I approved the next rejection without changing my position. On the 10th day, the other attorney called mine directly and said they would accept the terms as written if I agreed not to pursue any further claims against the family trust or property after the baby was born. I told the lawyer to accept. The document was signed electronically 2 days later. The pregnancy cost agreement was set aside. The trust language that would have limited my involvement was removed. My older brother and my father retained control of the property they had been moving, but they could not use it to reach the child or any decisions I made about the child's life. I did not call my father or my older brother to confirm the signing. I sent a short message to my cousin Brooke letting her know the matter was resolved and that I would be focusing on the baby. She replied that she was glad and that she would visit after the birth if I wanted company. I told her I would let her know. Mrs. Klein sent a card with a small knitted blanket. I wrote her a thank you note and put the blanket in the nursery. The weeks after the settlement were quiet. My father did not call again. My older brother sent one message through the lawyers asking if I needed anything for the hospital. I did not reply. The absence felt like a door that had closed on its own. I kept working, kept the prenatal appointments, and kept the nursery ready. When people at work asked about the family, I said the baby and I were doing well and left it there. One afternoon near the end of the pregnancy, I received a letter from my father's attorney. It was a formal notice that the family trust had been updated and that I was no longer listed as a beneficiary for any future distributions. The letter was polite and stated that the change had been made in accordance with the terms discussed during the settlement. I read it once, placed it in the folder with the other documents, and did not mention it to anyone. The baby was due in 6 weeks. The folder went into a drawer in the office and stayed there. I gave birth on a Tuesday morning in a hospital in Columbus. The delivery was straightforward. I held the baby afterward and counted the fingers and toes the way the nurses showed me. My cousin Brooke came the next day with flowers and stayed for an hour. Mrs. Klein sent another card. No one from the Ohio house called or visited. I signed the birth certificate with only my name and went home 3 days later with the baby in the car seat I had installed myself. In the months that followed, I built a routine that did not include calls from my father or my older brother. The baby grew. I returned to work part-time and arranged childcare through a neighbor's daughter who was home from college. When the first birthday came, I invited Brooke and Mrs. Klein. We had cake in the backyard. No one asked about the family I had left in Ohio. I did not bring it up. The folder stayed in the drawer. I opened it once a year on the date the agreement had been signed to remind myself why the door had closed. The voice message transcript and Mrs. Klein's statement were still there. The settlement papers were on top. I read the first page, closed the folder, and put it away again. The baby played on the floor nearby. Outside the window, the street was quiet. I had the life I had chosen when I signed the paper that night in Ohio and then walked away from the people who had written it. The cost was the family I had once believed would always be there. The gain was the quiet that came after. The years after the settlement settled into a steady rhythm that belonged only to the baby and me. I named her Emma. She arrived on time and healthy, and the first months passed in the small routines of feeding schedules and doctor visits that I handled without help from Ohio. My coworker Dana Ellis brought meals twice a week for the first month and stayed to hold Emma while I showered. My friend from the New Moms group, Alicia Rivera, introduced me to a reliable babysitter when I returned to work part-time. These were the people who showed up. I did not compare them to anyone else. Emma's first birthday came and went with a small cake in the backyard. Brooke drove down from Cleveland and stayed the night. Mrs. Klein sent a card with a check for a savings bond. I opened it, wrote a thank you note, and put the card in the same drawer as the old folder. The folder stayed closed. I had no reason to open it again. The voice message and Mrs. Klein's statement had done their work when they needed to. After that, they were just paper. When Emma turned 2, I received a short email from my father's attorney. It stated that the property transfer my older brother had pursued had encountered additional review because of questions raised during the earlier settlement. The email did not ask for anything from me. It simply informed me that the matter was being handled internally. I read it once, deleted it, and went back to helping Emma stack blocks on the living room floor. The information did not change what I had already chosen. It only confirmed that the buried agreements had not stayed buried. Brooke called every few months. She never asked about my father or my older brother directly. Instead, she talked about her own life and asked about Emma's milestones. Once she mentioned that other relatives had started asking her why I no longer came to family events. She told them the same thing I would have told them: the relationship had ended on terms I could live with. She did not press for more details, and I did not offer them. That was enough. The absence of my father and my older brother became a fact rather than a wound. Holidays passed without calls. Emma's preschool concerts happened without anyone from Ohio in the audience. I took the photos myself and sent a few to Brooke and Mrs. Klein. When Emma asked about grandparents, I told her the simple truth that some families are small by choice. She accepted it the way children accept facts and went back to playing. I did not fill the space with explanations or anger. The space stayed quiet, and that was the point. By the time Emma started kindergarten, the townhouse felt like home in a way the Ohio house never had after the weekend I left. I had been promoted to director of marketing at the company. The work was demanding but predictable. I set boundaries on hours and kept them. When colleagues invited me to after-work events, I went when it fit Emma's schedule and declined when it did not. No one pushed. The people who stayed in my life understood the lines I had drawn. One afternoon, when Emma was 6, I came home to find a letter in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet from my older brother. It was not an apology or a request. It was a short statement that he had sold the rental property and that the proceeds had been distributed according to the updated trust. He wrote that he thought I should know in case any old documents still existed in my files. I read the letter twice, then tore it into small pieces and put the pieces in the recycling bin. I did not reply. There was nothing left to negotiate. That night after Emma was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The drawer with the folder was within reach, but I left it closed. The choices that had been made in Ohio had led to this kitchen, this quiet house, this child sleeping upstairs. The cost had been the automatic presence of blood relatives at birthdays and holidays. The gain had been the ability to raise Emma without the weight of hidden agreements or conditional support. I had chosen the gain. I would choose it again. Emma grew taller and louder and more curious. She asked questions about the world that I answered as directly as I could. When she asked why we did not visit the house in Ohio, I told her that some doors close for good reasons and that our life was here now. She nodded and asked if we could plant flowers in the backyard instead. We did. The flowers came up every spring after that. Mrs. Klein passed away when Emma was 8. Brooke and I went to the small service in Ohio. We did not go to my parents' house. After the service, we drove back to Columbus and had dinner at a diner near my townhouse. Brooke said she was glad I had let her be part of Emma's life. I told her I was glad she had chosen to stay. We did not talk about the people we had left behind. There was nothing new to say. Emma is 10 now. She plays soccer on weekends and reads chapter books at night. I still work at the same company and still keep the same boundaries. The folder in the drawer has not been opened in years. I know what is inside and I know why it matters less every year. The voice message that played by accident in the car and the statement Mrs. Klein gave to the lawyer were the evidence that let me walk away cleanly. They also showed me that shared blood had never guaranteed shared loyalty. That lesson arrived late, but it arrived completely. I built the life I have with the resources I had and the people who chose to stand with me. My father and my older brother kept the property and the control they wanted. They also kept the distance that came with it. I do not know if they ever understood what the agreement really cost them. I do not need to know. The baby I carried through that weekend in Ohio is now a girl who has never heard their voices. She knows only the version of family I chose to keep. That is the quiet closure I fought for and the one I intend to protect. If you have stayed with me through all of this, thank you for listening to my story. Choosing myself over the pressure to keep the peace inside a family that had already decided my place was an act of courage I did not fully understand at the time. It is still the choice I would make. Shared blood does not create loyalty when the agreements underneath are hidden and one-sided. I learned that the hard way, and I have no regrets about the family I left behind. Drop a okay if this hit home.